Hello and welcome to this video on the somewhat mythological health demerits of corsets. It is worth separating out medical corsets and fashion corsets. It is further worth noting that we will be limiting this video to modern corsets. These differ drastically from historically made or historically accurate corsets, which had very different production materials and methods. Modern products have many myths. These include organ damage, breathing problems, muscle damage, body shaping, and so on. These differ drastically from historical examples, and explain why the problems are more or less a modern development. Historically, corsets were not made anywhere near as extensively from steel as they are today, but largely from baleen or whalebone. Steel does not exert the same forces in the same way, and as such, it can cause harm to the body. And this is where we see many of the modern effects of corsetry come into play. Those incredibly narrow waists are really only viable using modern production techniques. The health claims that are often seen will stem from a combination of things. The most common is a difference in production materials and the knowledge around medicine and physiology that come into play with these new materials. Over time, we have learned more about how the human body behaves in response to stresses, such as a corset. The way a corset works is simple, but effective, and this is why it can be used not just as a fashion accessory or product, but also for medical reasons. By using something that is rigid or semi-rigid, like baleen or a synthetic version thereof, and in many cases steel, the material can be made strong, and so it won't move when put under pressure. This is why when the corset is laced up, it will pull in tight and it won't tear. This should make it fit tightly to the body. It also distributes force, that force being distributed in desirable ways to accentuate various features. Slim waist, a rather large bust, and so on. Again, this is largely only possible through the use of strong materials, cotton, canvas, satin, so on. Those provide the mesh in between the various parts of the corset, and the bones in it, which are made from steel in many cases or a plastic-like material, provide the directionality to this force. The stays are what act very similar to, say, the uprights in a building. It distributes the force in an up and down manner. And then there are also parts of the corset that are made from stiffened material. These are intended to do a few things. One is to provide a strong location for the closures of the corset. The other is to provide large-scale, wide area support and distribution of force, notably around the bust again. It can also be found in the areas near the connections at the back and along the center of the corset at the front. The use and wearing of a corset will allow someone to gradually reduce the size of their waist. It can begin by as little as 1 to 2 inches, this being roughly 5 centimeters at its highest, to up to 10 or more centimeters. This is done incrementally and through smaller and smaller corsets used each time. These are laced more tightly. That increased tightness in a structure that is otherwise not going to give way, in the case of a steel-based corset, are where we begin to see some of these myths come from. People who have ill-fitting or poorly customized versions. Let's start with the commonly claimed organ damage. The reality is, to a certain extent, your abdominal region will be crushed to some extent. Crushing is a somewhat hyperbolic term. In reality, it's more accurate to say compression, but the body, or at least the abdomen, is designed to be compressed to some extent. It's why you can bend, lift, and move freely. The abdominal region of the human body is incredibly flexible, and for women more so than men. It has to be for pregnancy to be possible. If that wasn't going to happen, the use of a corset would be impossible. It would have to physically break parts of the body to make things fit and shift. That does not happen. You will find, though, that the location of steel stays within a corset may cause pressure on areas of the body that are more sensitive and can cause discomfort in that way. Further to that, things like the stomach have to be able to expand. If they can't expand, and if you're a glutton, you may find that wearing a corset can be incredibly painful. Anybody who has eaten too much food would be familiar with the pain in your stomach from eating too much. It's the same thing, except that this is facilitated by the corset limiting how much can be consumed, not by the stretch of the stomach. Carbonated beverages have the same problem. The release of the gas can cause those organs to expand in the same way. A tight corset can then in turn cause that to be exacerbated. Although it's not permanent damage, it can lead to exacerbation of other problems. If you are going to ignore the obvious signs of discomfort, it can then lead to damage. There's also common examples such as breathing. This is often depicted in Hollywood, where people will faint from wearing a corset. The way this occurs is fairly simple. The corset would be on too tightly or hasn't been customized for the individual to provide the right distribution of force. The rib cage needs to be able to open up and out in order for someone to breathe. If all the force on the lower ribs prevents them from moving freely, that's why you would see this happening. And again, it comes down to sizing and customization. If it is a mass-produced and not customized corset, it will not allow the free movement for an individual. This is then mitigated by tying it less tightly at the back, and by not lacing it as tightly, the ribcage can freely move. The only other compensating mechanism is a change in the way the body will breathe, and often it will be shallow breathing, very much similar to hyperventilation. If we're talking about a corset made from less restrictive materials, that is more or less anything but steel, that same problem won't occur. The bones in the ribs should be strong enough to be able to counteract the pressure from the corset coming in, and the muscles between and outside the rib cage should be strong enough to push them out. It's often argued that women historically have been weakened by wearing of a corset. The argument is that when your abdominal and back muscles don't need to work because the corset is holding an individual upright, their muscles will weaken over time, and this is yet another misconception, although admittedly one that has some basis in reality in medical corsetry use today. We've mentioned how the parts of a corset are fundamentally meant to channel all the forces in an upright and downright manner. That verticality means that somebody who's wearing it must maintain posture, which can only be done by using the muscles that run along the spine and across the stomach. The core muscles are how they're sometimes called colloquially. This would, in theory at least, ensure somebody wearing a corset that is being properly put on and properly sized for them has to constantly be using those muscles, which should be strengthened. And these are the sorts of muscles that are being worked out during yoga, for instance, or Pilates. They're designed to be core to the body and ensure that things like posture are maintained, that those places in the body that are most likely to be injured, say for example back muscles, are continually exercised and made stronger. This leads to the application of corsetry as a medical product, that is a prosthesis. It would be more accurate to call these a brace, but the function and form are surprisingly similar. The idea with these is simple. They provide support and a certain amount of compression to parts of the body, but notably along the spine. That's the area that would normally be laced down tightly, or as tight as is comfortable. This then supports the lower back and possibly into the thoracic region. By having these and appropriate and adjustable stays within it, you can ensure that the forces are applied evenly along the entire body. Notably though, it's application of force along the spine, rib cage primarily, bony structures that aren't going to have the same sort of problems. Medical prostheses also often include a variety of extra layers of comfort that aren't available in commercial products, or at least not as readily available. These are things like padding that are going to avoid many of the pains and discomforts of wearing them as a fashion accessory, let's say. Common applications medically are for lumbago, back strain, spondylosis, and a few other conditions. All of this is taking advantage of the weight and force transfers we've mentioned already. It supports the back and moves weight from the back to the abdomen. This is a much larger muscle and one that's much more able to cope with the force that's being applied to it and then push back. By moving the forces away from the spine, spinal structures can be protected, or in the case of various conditions, shaped in the right way, and gives them time to recover. Those big muscles in your abdomen, you would often think of things like, say, the six-pack of an extreme athlete, are much stronger, and they are able to work much longer. The much smaller muscles in the spine and alongside the spine can't do this. By transitioning the weight from the back to the front, you protect the spine, and you can thereby avoid injury and trauma. It can also be used in the long-term recovery by wearing a brace that does this exact same function, but rather than preventing an injury, it prevents the exacerbation or may counteract an injury and give body the time to heal. As you can see, modern corsets are very different from historical corsets. Assuming you do not try to cinch your waist below 50 centimeters, then you are going to be safe with no lasting or notable harm. It's the extreme and ridiculous degrees to which some people try to push the image of a refined waist that is where you will find problems. But this is true of anything. Too much oxygen, too much water, running too much, and wearing a corset too tightly. Any of these can cause the same basic problems. Moderation is key. It could cause some considerable discomfort, especially if you're not familiar with how much you can eat or drink. And as we've mentioned, in extreme cases, if you are improperly using, wearing, and ignoring your body's own reactions, you can cause unexpected side effects and, in extreme cases, problems. But these are the outliers to an extreme degree. For the same reasons though, when you first begin wearing a corset, it can cause some pain and discomfort, especially as the body adapts to the unexpected pressures and you become used to wearing a corset that ensures that you continue to stand, sit, and otherwise move in an upright manner. These may involve muscles that you haven't really used properly before and aren't trained to exert the force they are exerting. That can then lead to the aforementioned pain and discomfort, but over time, you will get over this. The problem is modern, mass-produced, and cheap replicas or products. These can and generally are made from steel. They have no adjustment for each person. And so, where those pressures and forces come from on your body will often not be appropriate and it won't distribute the weight in the right way. With that happening, those large muscles, like those in your abdomen, can't work properly, and even if they try to, they don't really do anything. It may also not shift the weight from your back to your front. This means that those smaller spine muscles aren't going to be able to offload all of the work, but instead need to do it all themselves. These are much smaller muscles and can't keep working for as long and aren't anywhere near as strong. Overall, the idea of a corset is not necessarily unhealthy. It's more a case of informed use and purchasing, and in the case of a medical corset or brace, appropriate application under appropriate medical guidance. This is, for example, one problem with long-term uses of a brace. They can lead to weakness of those muscles, the muscles that over time should begin to pick up the work that they have been avoiding for recovery purposes. And that's perhaps the most significant way in which a corset could be unhealthy. People using them long beyond when they should stop. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.